Welcome everyone. Hello everyone. I want to welcome you. We have a wonderful turnout tonight. Good to see you all here. And I want to welcome you to this panel discussion on grant writing in humanities, co-sponsored by the Humanities Initiative, Graduate School of Arts and Science, and the FAS Dean for Humanities Office. We're going to have a great discussion tonight. I want to just give you one bit of information before we start, and that is where you might look for some of these grants. You're going to hear some more information about that, but I want to point out to you two resources that I think are really important to think about when you think about grants. The first one is to take a look at the GSAS fellowships page. Where can you find it? If you Google apply for fellowships NYU GSAS, you will find the page. It's on the GSAS main page. And on that page we list information about GSAS fellowships, external fellowships, and we also have a link for information that comes into us that we just post, kind of like a bulletin board of information. So that's one resource for you to have. The other resource that I think it's important for you to know about is a wonderful resource called the Foundation Center. How many people, does anyone know here about the Foundation Center? Okay, so some of you know about this. The Foundation Center is a not-for-profit that has all kinds of wonderful information about grants and fellowships. They have educational components about it, but the main thing that's useful for you, they have a wonderful database of grants that you can apply for. And you can find this database in a couple of ways. You can go to their website, www.foundationcenter.org, and you can find the database from their website. The problem is if you do it from your home computer, they will ask you to pay for this. Now, you don't have to. Why? Because you can do it through NYU Books Library. If you go to the library and you use the computers there, you can get into this database for free. The other option you have is you can go right to their offices. They're right at on 5th Avenue and 16th Street. And you can go into their offices and use the database there for free. It's a wonderful database. It has thousands, literally thousands of grant possibilities that you can look up and you can find exactly what might be something that fits your work and your background. So those are two really important resources for you to think about as you think about applying for grants. And our panelists are going to have many, many more ideas as well as talking about their own experience. So let me turn it over to the moderator of today's event, Dean Lauren Benton from FAS Dean for Humanities Office and Professor of History.
Thanks very much, Dean Talvacchia. Welcome, everyone. This is a wonderful opportunity. I think one of the things that I wanted to say, well, a couple of things to begin. The first one is that no matter what stage one is at of grant writing, no matter what stage of career, we all experience some anxiety around grant writing. So you should not feel that you are the only person who has ever felt anxiety in connection with this. And I think some of it may come up in discussion today, how to cut through that. But here's something to consider. We have a panel today of successful grant writers, but by definition, they're also unsuccessful grant writers. That is to say, there is no grant writer who has gotten a grant who has not also been turned down for one. And so some of the process is just to be, they'll admit to this, no doubt, to be intrepid about it and to learn how to just put yourself in a position where you can be successful, and that means sometimes setting yourself up for rejection. It's just part of the process. Now, as far as I wanted to add to the resources that were mentioned by Dean Talvacchia, the Humanities Initiative has put together a wonderful list of grants for graduate student funding in the humanities and humanistic social sciences. It's really very comprehensive and save you some of the work maybe of looking for these things on your own. It's going to be on the Humanities Initiative website and also soon will be on the GSAS website. And it also lists helpfully eligibility requirements and whether which of these grants may be available to international students. So it's a good resource for everyone. So let me go ahead and introduce the panel. We have, as I said, more successful than unsuccessful, very successful grant writers here to share tips with you. Professor Helen Nissenbaum of Media, Culture, and Communications in Steinhardt. Professor Emily Martin in the Department of Anthropology. Professor Ara Mergian from the Department of Italian Studies and Art History. Professor Guy Ortolano from the Department of History. Maggie Popkin, a Ph.D. candidate in the Institute of Fine Arts, and Reynolds Richter, also Ph.D. candidate in the Department of History. And we can, depending on how people like to do this, you can interrupt, I think, with a pressing question. We'll have plenty of time to leave for questions at the end, so you might want to hold on to them, but we also don't want to interrupt the flow. If you need a point of clarification, I think the speakers would be happy to have you break in. So, Professor Nissenbaum, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me here, and I must apologize to my fellow panelists and to you that I messed up my schedule and I'm going to have to slink out of here early. So if you have questions for me, please feel free to raise your hand and I'd be happy to answer. Just a little bit of background. My PhD is in philosophy. I'm now in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. What I study is digital media and some of the social, political, and legal issues related to digital media, internet, privacy, and so forth. And so the grants that I'm going to be talking to you about are grants mainly from the National Science Foundation. I've actually had some funding with collaborators from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and recently from the Department of Health and Human Services, having to do with health information privacy. So it's not, these particular granting agencies are not necessarily going to be available for all humanities scholars, but probably for people in philosophy, philosophy of science, history of science, generally STS, anthropology, and so forth, for those of you whose humanistic studies look at science and technology. And what I've done, first of all, I have way more failed grant applications than successful ones. So I feel a little bit concerned to give you advice, given that I've tried to follow my own advice on all these occasions, and yet, the batting average isn't great, though in the end of the day, I try to remember only the successes. So here are the 8 tips that I'm going to offer you, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I do think they're all good for particularly the agencies that I have interacted with, and probably some of my colleagues are going to contradict me with respect to the ones that you've applied for successfully. So my number one is, it's not number one in importance, but sort of chronologically. The first tip is take a hint. And what I mean by that is if you get a request from some office or some foundation or some funding agency to review a grant application by someone else or to sit on a panel, anything like that, you know that you're a good candidate to apply for a grant at that office, because it means that you are being recognized as an expert in some area. And so and actually I needed a colleague after a number of years of being on panels and reviewing grants, tapping on me on the shoulder and saying, you should apply. I hadn't connected that, but that's just, the first tip. The second tip, and this again applies, I have been fortunate in this case, and that is I've been sought out and I have found good collaborative options. And this has opened up for me certain funding opportunities that I could not get by myself. And so many of you probably know the National Science Foundation mainly funds scientists and engineers, and by being included and seeking out collaborations with scientists and engineers, I've managed to tap into monies that would never ordinarily be available to social scientists and humanists. So so to the extent your field promotes collaborations, these cross-disciplinary collaborations can be very productive for granting opportunities. Now to the the shape of a grant application. Again, having sat on the side of review, your grant proposal, and this could be again obvious, it should have a thesis. So the reviews that I've done don't like proposals that say things like, I am going to study such and such, or I'm going to discuss such and such. You need to come in with a positive thesis, a positive proposal. I'm going to show that A relates to B in the following way. So you need to have a well-articulated positive thesis, even if it's bold, even if it's bolder than you think you can actually prove. But it sits better. It shows. It suggests if you're just going to study something, then people are thinking, oh, why is she only or he only just studying it now? You really need to have a statement. And then again, National Science Foundation are very big on methodology. So of course you have to show how you're going to show this and show that you have a good grip on the relevant methods or methodologies. They want to see that you actually can walk through a project and achieve the goals that you set yourself out to do. Now, being a philosopher, most of the time I'm saying, I'm going to argue this point. I'm going to analyze and argue the point. And I know that when a social scientist is reading proposals from a humanist, they're like, what's your methodology? Where's your empirical work? So there's a lot of problem when you're sitting in a cross-disciplinary environment, and so to the extent you can, you need to really put the methodology out there, and sometimes it's just to show what literatures you're drawing on. Then more sort of mechanical advice, tip number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is get to know the cognizant program officer. Now again, this is probably different. If you're dealing with a foundation, a private foundation, versus a public granting agency, there could be a difference, because with foundations, sometimes the program officers actually kind of hide away and you need a connection to open the door for you. But for a public funding agency, the program officers, and Emily, I know you deal a lot with NSF, I don't know your experience, but mine is, they really want you to contact them because they're sitting in a building in Arlington, Virginia, and they don't really know easily what's going on out in the world. So when you're contacting them, you're also educating them to what's going on out there. Don't think, oh, I'm interrupting them and how can I possibly contact? If their name's on the website, you should know that they want you to contact them. And in fact, some of the program officers would welcome you, popping in when you're in DC, not without an appointment, but they would be open to that. And some are really generous, and if you say, can I send you an abstract, we are more than happy to read an abstract and give you advice. So this is strong advice for you. Don't be shy to this. Don't be shy about this. And then finally, and that's all my points, getting to point number 8, tip number 8, which is, apply early, apply often. So that's it. If you get turned down, just do it again. Thank you.
We told Professor Nissenbaum has to leave early. If anybody has a question for her, now would be a good time. Okay, we'll go ahead then. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm an anthropologist, and I have gotten grants from a lot of different places, maybe a dozen, private, public, over the years. Most of what I'm going to say I've learned from 2 program officers, since Helen mentioned this already. One from the Werner Grant Foundation, which is specifically for anthropology, and the other is from the NSF anthropology program. They're both very generous with their time and welcome the kind of interaction that Helen was talking about. So I have some, I'm going to watch my time because I probably could take longer than I'm supposed to take. Some general remarks that I think apply to the process of applying, and then some specific
tips, hints, whatever, about the application itself, or a piece of writing that you hand in, because a grant application is a piece of writing. So it's very important to focus on just what goes into that and what it should look like. So first, the general things. This builds on a couple of things that Helen said. Find out about the source you're applying to. Find out everything about it. Go to the website. Push into the website. Go to all the tabs. Go to all the links. Read the history. Find the annual report. They're public, entities. They have annual reports. Find it. Read it. Look for grant applications that have been approved. They won't list the ones that were rejected, probably, but you can learn a lot, even if all you have are the topic headings, the titles of grant proposals that have been approved by the foundation or the organization, whatever it is. It's like applying for a job. If you were applying for a job, you would find out everything about the organization that had the job opening, right? You would really do your research ahead of time. This is very similar. It's somehow this step gets missed. You've got to figure out what they want to fund, their mission statement, their goals. They have them. And you have to make your research fit their mission statement and goals, or they won't fund you. It's that simple. They give lots of choices of who to fund. They will not fund you if you don't make a good case that you are what they are looking for. Next thing is, many apply, few are chosen. So you have 1 minute. Imagine you have 1 minute to catch the attention of the reader. What are you going to say at the very beginning to capture the attention, to make your research seem compelling and important? You really have to put work into this. It is not like writing a paper for a class. We all do those. We all know what it is to write an essay. And you can count on your professor reading the whole paper and being patient. And if you haven't got it quite clear in the first page, they'll keep going, read second, third, and whatever. Not so with a grant application. You are dealing with a review board. The organizations vary, but some kind of review board that is probably going to have to contend with dozens and dozens and dozens of similar pieces of paper. So you've got to do something to make what you want to do jump out. Read the op-ed project website for tips on how to make a pitch, because in a certain way you are making a pitch. You have to put something compelling and attention-getting up front. You should be clear, you should have good ideas, they should be feasible, and you should, this may be obvious, but believe me, lots of people don't do it, you should say what you're going to do with the money. It's not a class paper, it's a project for which you are asking for money. So it's sort of like a job application. I forgot to look at what time I started. I looked at my watch, but okay. So some specific comments about the parts of a proposal. Every organization is different, but I tried to make this fit a lot of different cases. Usually there's an introductory part or a beginning part, or it could be called project description or something like that. This should give the reader a good sense of the overall project. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Realize that they're probably not a specialist in your area. They might not even be in your discipline. And, pick a person in your life who's an educated reader but not an expert in your field, and speak to them. Write it for whoever would fit that bill. Your roommate, your sister, your next door neighbor. So try to make it for a non-specialist, unless you know for sure that your foundation is going to be reviewing with specialist readers, which is very unusual. Even in the specific anthropology foundation, we're told if you want to work on cash crop, let's say Guatemalan coffee growers and gender, suppose that's your topic. Your proposals will be likely to be read by somebody who works on gender in French history, by someone who does cash crop farming in Africa, and by someone who studies education in Guatemala. So each one has some overlap, but no one matches up for the whole thing. So you have to be able to communicate across disciplinary lines. In the beginning part of the proposal, give it a good overall sense of it. Don't forget to state the obvious.
imagine that the person doesn't know anything about it much. And then be sure to state what you want to find out. This is what Helen called the thesis. You have to have a thesis. It doesn't have to be a hypothesis, but it has to be something that you are going to find out that will add to knowledge. This is what almost all foundations and organizations are looking for. You're going to find out something that will add to our knowledge. But it can't just be, as Helen already said, I'm going to study this, I'm going to describe that, I'm going to find out about X. And this leads to the second part of most proposals, which is, how does this relate to work that has already been done? Almost all proposals have what is sometimes called them literature reviews. What you need to do is tell the reader why it's important to know what you want to find out. How will this shed light on our overall current state of knowledge? And this is the nub of this message is, it is not enough to say, there is a gap in our knowledge and I'm going to fill it. It's not enough. There's so many gaps. Think of all the gaps. Why should I fund this gap? I got a lot of other gaps over here. You can say that, but then you have to go on to say, why is this gap important? What will this gap that I'm going to fill show us about processes we need to understand? It's like you have to write these things down and have them in front of you, and when you're writing your grant proposal, you go, oh my God, there I am doing it again. I'm talking about a gap. Not enough. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, this is really important. It's a very good idea to articulate a problem or a debate that's out there in the literature that is unsolved or which has contradictory directions. And your research will show which direction is better or more profitable or enlightening, so that you have a specific state of the knowledge and then a way to push things further in the terms and the form of your specific research. So don't just say I'm going to build on existing knowledge. Don't just say I'm going to contribute to, all this is good, building and contributing, but go on to say how. How will it build on? How will it contribute? I hope this is making sense, because I know that this is what readers look for. The next thing, I have 4 things. This is the third thing. This is what comes from the Winter Grant Foundation. Remember I said there was a beginning section, and then a grant review section, and then there's usually something called loosely a methods, or it could be called other things, but that's generally the idea. When you get to the methods section, no matter what field you're in, get back your first section. Get back in front of you what you said you were going to do in section 1. And when you write section 3, methods, make sure they match, because often they don't. Here's what I want to do, here's my methods. And the reader will go, yeah, this is a good problem, I think this would be good to fund, but these methods are not going to lead to this result. You have to make them match very closely, and you have to show how the methods you choose, whatever they are, will enlighten the questions you said you wanted to study in part 1. The Winter Grant Foundation project director said that something like 80% of the grants she reviews, part 1 and part 3 do not match. And what happens then? She tosses them out. The last thing is you have to usually say what your preparation is for doing the project. Don't be modest. Really don't be modest. Language training, prior visits, connections. Some people think it would be sort of bragging to talk about their connections and their, prior travel or whatever it might be. Don't be modest. The foundation wants to know that this job will get done. And the more you can say you're capable, you have experience, you have setup, you have whatever, the more they're going to feel that that's true and that they will get out of it what they want, which is a product. They want a product. Maybe a dissertation, an article, a book, contribution to knowledge, whatever. They want something to happen. And they want to know if they give you money, you will go out and make something happen. That's it.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks very much.
What I'm going to essentially read, because it's now, is a talk that I was invited to give a couple years ago at USC on the fellowship writing and the task of self-description. So it's a little bit more about the craft of writing, and is hence, in some senses, writerly, I guess, itself. So I just have a couple of images. I want to maybe dim the light just a tiny bit, but it's not entirely necessary. Within the shadowy recesses of an endless gallery, its ruptured vault cloaked by vapor of sky, lie the mutilated fragments of ancient statuary. Seated amidst the debris of columns and busts, an artist sketches the sundered remains of the past. This sanctuary of loss, haunted as much by the dream of cultural transmission as by the reality of a vanishing patrimony, was conjured by Hubert Robert in his 1796 painting representing the new Musée du Louvre's Grande Galerie, imagined in a future state of ruin. Few other contemporary paintings make so eerily vivid the crisis of revolutionary France, its dual impulses to monumentalize and to destroy. Few others, moreover, so arrestingly intimate the aftermath of the Enlightenment in the ruins of revolution. Robert's oeuvre provides a vital yet understudied record of the volatile cultural and political landscape of late 18th century Paris, as seen through the eyes of an artist whose own practice, as my dissertation will argue, poignantly embodied the contradiction of its times. These are not my words, nor was this my project. It is the first paragraph written by a dear friend and colleague whose application, even as we were applying to the same fellowships from the same graduate school, stood for me as exemplary. Exemplary of the seemingly magical kind of writing that these grant essays demand. An alchemy of urgency and humility, broad strokes and detail, expert precision and intellectual generosity. But most of all, without the aid of an actual image, it runs the reader's eyes over that crumbled vault. It brings the vapor of sky onto the page with a palpable presence. It links fleeting metaphysics to a tangible and concrete history. Conversely, it makes their materiality into an intellectual problem. Substituting words for images, transcribing its object into the temporality of language, it takes us from practicality to concept and back again in the space of a paragraph. Whether that matter is aesthetic, historical, anthropological, or otherwise, I think the lesson here applies across the board. Like any piece of writing, the fellowship essay serves as a double for its author. Of all the kinds of writing we do as academics, almost none is as particular as that hybrid literary genre called the fellowship application. Its particularity is that it performs its aims at the same time as it describes or proposes them. In other words, you are already giving your reader a sample of your writing, a stand-in for its method and substance. It gives a foretaste of its conclusions while leaving the reader hungry for the actual meal, and it tries to avoid corny, well-worn metaphors like the one I just used. It would be disingenuous to pretend that I have all the answers here. I will simply give a few smaller observations and suggestions based on my own experience. In my case, this meant the study of an early 20th century painter whose work engages with philosophy, literature, and architecture. Giorgio de Chirico's imaginary cityscapes reconcile fragments of real topographies with a solipsistic philosophical worldview. Conflating both pre-Socratic antiquity and aspects of modernity, these cities cannot be traced to any one place in particular. Only those initiated into the insights of Nietzschean philosophy, of which de Chirico was an assiduous and jealous student. These images are intended then as modern oracles, secular revelations of the urban everyday. They are admixtures of citations and locations, the modern shop windows of Paris merging with Roman arcades and Renaissance squares. And so, a modernist painter whose images responded in pictorial and architectonic terms to philosophical problems, a painter whose work served not as personal reveries, but in their hostile refusal of time articulated several other things, the relationship of painting to philosophy, for example, and in turn, the relationship to depicting or resisting history. I thus had a richly interdisciplinary topic on a major artist whom little substantive scholarship existed with regard to architecture. But at the same time, I needed to convince my interlocutors that what I was saying was well within the bounds of art history. I had to overcome what Adam Przeworski and Frank Solomon call the disciplinary superego of my readers. I had to make a case, in other words, that I had to spend time looking firsthand at spaces and objects, and the second, to have institutional resources in order to do so, linking them to specific ends, historical and theoretical. And so here I segue back out onto some general principles. Even if your field is a new or hybrid one, you must make the case that your project has a wider upshot. Your work, you want to say, will answer at once some particular problems, but also stir further ones. If you are investigating the particular absence of a writer or series of events from the record, that resurrection should strike readers from any background as a worthy aim. All the while, you must demonstrate that the dissertation or project is a feasible thing in its own right. What are its aims? What constitutes its chapters? How will the method exfoliate the encrusted skin of past work? More practically, where are you going and when, where are you going and when, why, how? I am a fan of these kinds of non-rhetorical questions that you ask to move your essay along, questions that sharpen your broad points into poignant jabs, poking the reader out of passivity. And to that advice, I would add just 5 particular tips. One, avoid, that seem relatively banal, but I think important, avoid passive verb constructions and the verb to be. Use active, forceful verbs and constructions. My project argues that. I contend that. My chapter claims that. Number 2, incorporate a timeline of tasks, but without too much minutia. Number 3, drafts. By the time your Fulbright application reaches its 11th draft, you should want to throw your computer into the East River. 4, have academic and non-academic friends read it and offer their candid reaction. Readability applies in several different ways and across disciplines. 5, and this ties in with what Professor Nissenbaum was just saying, acknowledge the work of other scholars and do not dismiss it as irrelevant, but rather foundational to your work. And I'll just sort of cut to the end here. One fellowship proposal I recently read on a committee exemplifies some of the best kind of writing. It shuttles between the descriptive detail of one single object and a larger problem. Opening with a description of an artwork as it sits in a musty archival box, it opens up immediately onto the social and epistemological import of the work itself. The ignored, forgotten piece of art stands in both metaphorically and synecdochally for the project's larger aims, its recuperation of a particular history. The reader, in this case myself, was left feeling like the object forgotten in a storeroom was a ticking bomb. Its historical significance, the reader was left feeling, could be diffused by this particular dissertation. The dissertation was a rescue effort, and a worthy one, because we were shown why the object matters and what it stands for. And this brings us back to where I began, with the Louvre in ruins. The opening paragraph of the predoctoral fellowship I read to you resonated with one reader from the Getty Museum, who later mentioned the essay to a few of her colleagues, so impressed was she by its economy and precision. It drew her, she once told me, into that crumbled vault. As much as its descriptive richness took her and the committee back to a historical moment, the essay led them along by the hand to survey the future of the project. Now, to be frank, the proposal's writer, when I asked permission to read her work today, lent it to me on one caveat. And she said, excuse my French, please stress to them that I had no fucking clue what I was doing. But rather than a letdown or a cautionary tale, I think we can draw a lesson from that, which is that if this author had no clue as to what she was doing, she faked it damn well. The proposal has to convey what one is going to do, in what libraries and why. It must convey broader arguments in specific objects that anchor the project. So even if your project remains haunted by unanswered questions and queries, describe those as part of its fabric. And as a happy coda to that anecdote, that Clueless Fellowship application is actually written 8 years ago, is now a book from the Getty Press. So its ruins have been made over into an actual future. So it, in fact, is not a cautionary tale, but a very happy one.
It's a happy tale, but it's also, I find this incredibly intimidating. My bullet points, they're adding up. I'm getting in the nearly 20 now, and maybe if we can have a successful enough proposal, we'll get a book out of it. It's becoming I kind of want to leave and revise my grant application. So I'm just going to, I'll say I'm Guy Ortolano. I'm in the history department. I work on modern British history. Earlier I worked in the history of science, and now I work on urban history. So the kinds of things I apply for, with not always with success, are the NEH, Fulbright, ACLS, the American Philosophical Society, the Josephine de Carmen Fellowship for graduate students, SSRC, and Newcomb. I have 5 more tips to add to the pile, but luckily a lot of them just echo what we've already heard. One is that it's true that most times we are not successful, but I think it is also true that every time we apply for things, our project improves. There's never been a kind of grant application season that has come and gone that I haven't understood my own work better, and I haven't had an idea by November that I hadn't had in August by virtue of the process of thinking for a couple of months and reading and revising. And I think this is true for the job market as well. Most applications don't result in jobs, but almost every cycle of trying to get a job makes you a better scholar and helps tune you into what people are interested in and helps you articulate what you're interested in. And I think the same applies for these things. So most of the time we'll fail, but it's, I think, never really a failure. The way my wrestling coach put it in high school, when I had just been smashed by this guy who couldn't possibly have been in my weight class. He was twice my size, and demolished me in the end of the first tournament I entered. And my coach, very wise, I think, said, you have to get second before you can get first. And I don't think of Coach Liebig that often, but I think there is a lot of wisdom in that. You have to apply and fail to get fellowships and jobs before you're going to get them. But it's a process that will wind up with fellowships, jobs, and books. A point that I recently did another one of these in the history department, and what we did was to share failed applications that subsequently became successful. So I was particularly paying attention to changes that I had made in applications over time. I do not issue this as a law. I'm just saying the kind of lesson I took based on reading colleagues' successful applications and what I did, and I did have more luck, but again, it's certainly no rule. But I used to begin with richly evoked anecdotes that I thought would capture the reader's attention. I think I violated the 1-minute rule. And I changed it following my colleague Carl Lapoon, who just starts off by saying huge claims. And I found that pretty helpful, actually. So, not unreasonable claims, perfectly reasonable claims, but nevertheless, rather than starting off with the anecdote that I thought would get people transfixed by my research into the 1950s England, I just started saying big things that I thought that my research might turn up. And that was the single biggest change I made. And I do think that there is a lesson in that. That said, along the way in the application, I just want to echo what everyone has already said about the importance of specificity, and certainly how you're going to use their money. But also in my case, and I find this one of those helpful exercises for thinking, again, in my case, I don't know if it's required or is appropriate, but whenever I've developed a table of contents, it's often been through the process of a grant application, and rarely will that table of contents actually show up one day in a dissertation or a book, but the process of having a part of my proposal where I talk about what chapter 1 is going to look at and show in chapter 2 and 3, not in mind-numbing detail, but the big stakes and claims of each chapter. That's a kind of specificity that I imagine is appreciated, especially if you've begun with very large claims, as I've just recommended. And I also think, again, even if you don't get the application, it's that kind of thinking. What does my project look like? Not when I just say large claims or describe appealing anecdote, but when I actually lay out the logic of the project, and I try to force myself to come up with a table of contents, even though I'm a year or two away from really having one. I think that's a good intellectual exercise that'll pay dividends, even if you don't get the fellowship. 2 more things. One I got from Jane Tylis last year when I was applying for these things, and I bounced an application off of her, and she said she noticed that I hadn't mentioned any other scholars in my application, which is a big oversight, but I had just never thought about it. And so this is thinking about the move from unsuccessful to successful applications. In the revision and ultimately successful application, I did start to mention scholars and kind of weaving them in as appropriate into certain parts of the proposal, especially where I was talking about at the end, when I was talking about, I think, the 3 biggest stakes of the project. And I actually think this is very helpful because, among other things, what it does is it takes me, I'm a junior professor and relatively unknown, but I can immediately elevate myself into a conversation with Fred Cooper and Jan Prakash, and I was suddenly, this is a way of signaling to readers. I don't have to convince them that my take on, cities that were never built in the 1960s is interesting. I can show how it's in conversation with a recent volume by Jan Prakash and Kevin Cruz at Princeton, and I don't say Princeton, that seemed crass, but I can talk about, I can put myself into conversation with scholars as a kind of shortcut for signaling bigger conversations. What am I doing? Okay, so I'm going to add one thing to that too. I gave that advice to somebody, to a friend, and he used it, and he wrote this grant application in which he completely disparaged all previous scholars and conversations, and I finished, and it's not that he was rude, my problem was not that this was impolite or disrespectful, but what he convinced me is that that he is contributing another brick to a historiography that's utterly worthless, and he went through about 30 years of failed efforts and disappointing turns and leads, and so I think what you want to do if you are going to insert yourself into conversations is to insert yourself, even if they're lacking in some way, and you can contribute, of course, but I think that you want to do that by building on exciting conversations, not pointing out the failings of other scholars' conversations. And then my last point is just thinking again about the job market process, applying for jobs, and I think it is also true of grant applications, and that is that when you talk to people, whether it's in a hotel room when you're applying for a job and you're interviewing, or if you're just talking over your project, what gets a reaction from people when their ears perk up, or when they ask you a follow-up question. And all of our projects, we have so many chapters and different dimensions, and our projects are making lots and lots of claims, and maybe at the end of your proposal, in my case, I just wanted to kind of highlight the 3 largest or 3 most interesting claims. And so I had to figure out, of all the things that I think I'm doing, what would I be most wise to signal in particular, to focus on in particular. And so I didn't necessarily choose the ones that I'm genuinely most interested in, and I don't think this is a cynical point. I have my interest in a kind of microscopic reconstruction of politics inside Cambridge colleges. I think that's really interesting. But if that's one of my 3, and it's one of the things my archival research is actually most appropriate for, and it does have bigger stakes, I think I could make the case. But if I only have 3, I'm going to talk about the things that when I mention them in interviews or to colleagues, that they too are interested in. I don't have to do a big rigmarole to get them interested. And so in my case, it was something about historical methodology, and something about urban history, and something about global history. And there are other directions that could have gone, but you have to narrow down somehow. You can't name everything. So do pay attention to what other people's faces are telling you. And what other people's faces are telling me is that it's somebody else's turn.
That goes back to the take a 10 point, as Ms. Butler did. Thank you very much.
How many of you are graduate students? I mean, is everybody here? Okay, good, because that's the only experience that I have to share with you. I just got back from a year in Italy, where I spent the last year doing research for a dissertation on Roman architecture in Rome, and I was funded by 2 fellowships, by a Fulbright and by a fellowship from the Max Planck Institute as part of one of their international research prizes in the humanities. I also applied for 4 other fellowships that I did not get, but was lucky enough that the Max Planck one is also funding me this year. So I just wrote a list of 7 points that I hope are kind of practically useful for people applying in not just art history, but in any field in the humanities. And then I'm happy to, if any of you are art historians, can answer more specific questions later. There may be some redundancy, but I think some of our panelists have made what are really important points. So I'll just get started. This kind of goes back to what Professor Martin said about doing all the research you can about the organizations you're applying for.
too. I think it's really important to know what each fellowship you're applying to is looking for in its candidates, and to really explain and know on specific terms why you fit the bill better than all the other, for some colleges, hundreds, even thousands of candidates that they're going to be seeing. So for Fulbright, for example, they're an institution that is really interested in global citizenship and cultural exchange, in sort of community involvement, not just the academic aspects of your research. And so for my Fulbright essay, I really focused on my involvement in those areas. For the Max Planck Fellowship, which is an international research project on the role of memory in Roman culture, I know that the panel couldn't have cared less if I was interested in global citizenship or in cultural exchange. They wanted to know how my dissertation fits in with certain European currents in memory studies. So that's what I talked about in that essay. I think related to that, and it is really important to know the audience of who's going to be on the fellowship committee. And this can be either a general sense that, for example, for Fulbright, your fellowship is going to be read at NYU by people who are not in your department, at the national level by people who may not even have an academic background, and certainly when you get to the country that you're applying to, by people who, again, are coming from very different academic backgrounds and from non-academic backgrounds as well. In that case, I think aiming for a more general reader is really important. For Fulbright, you also have to keep in mind that if you make it to the final stage, your application is going to be read by people for whom English is not necessarily their first language. And I think really clear, pithy writing is the way to go for that application. You don't want, it's nice to write an academic jargon that maybe your American colleagues will understand, although I'm not even sure I advocate that anyway, but certainly for, I think, some international fellowships it's not appropriate. If you are applying for the kind of thing I was applying for with the Max Planck Institute or the Rome Prize, for example, you can know that people who are reading your application will be much more familiar with your field, although we'll be still approaching it from different disciplinary perspectives. For things like the Rome Prize, it's actually possible to know the exact people who will be on the committee in any given year. If you do a little gossiping with your advisor, you will know that. And it's worth doing because then you know what the exact research interests are of the people who will be reading your application. I think it's also really important in your application to justify why you need their money, right? There are so many students. I think the Rome Prize gets over 1,000 applications each year. Fulbright, some countries, in Western Europe get hundreds of applications. Why do you need their money? Now, I was applying only for fellowships that support research abroad because that's what I needed to do this past year. So I needed to make clear why I absolutely had to be abroad, what I was going to do with that year that I couldn't get done in America. I think probably the same is true for fellowships like the CLIR that support archival research. You have to explain why you need to go to that particular archive and why you can't get it done at NYU. I think it's important in that sense to say exactly what you're going to do, to be as specific as possible, not to say, well, I'm going to use the libraries in Rome and see what I find there, but to say I have done a research trip of 4 weeks to Rome the spring before. I know that X, Y, Z, these are the exact libraries that I need to use. These are the archives in those libraries that I want to go to, and I've spoken to the librarians in charge, and they have given me permission to use them. Because the people reading these essays, particularly for research abroad, will know that if you haven't done that preparatory work, there's no way in a country, first world country like Italy, that you're going to get that done. It's just not going to happen. I think it's important to make clear what you will accomplish with their funds that is both critical to your research, like you can't write your dissertation without it, and also why you wouldn't be able to do it without their money. So because of those 3 points, I think the best practical piece of advice that I can give, and what I think made the biggest difference in my fellowship applications, was to have as many different people as possible from as many different backgrounds and levels of expertise read and comment on your fellowship essays. I think it's great to have your advisor read your essays, and hopefully they will, but don't only have your advisor read your essays. I can't even believe the number of people that I imposed on to read my fellowship essays, and basically anybody who would do it, I had to do it. And that included various professors, both from the Institute of Fine Arts, from other departments that I know, undergraduate professors, friends who work for the IIE that oversees the Fulbright organization. My poor husband probably read more drafts than he knew what to do with, and he doesn't know anything about my field, but I think he's a good writer. So this, I think, is particularly important for fellowships where you know the selection committee is composed of people coming from different backgrounds. And it really will help ensure that your essay is both comprehensible to people from different fields, but also, we've talked about the importance of this, is exciting and interesting to people who are not intimately familiar with your very specific dissertation topic. The second piece of practical advice is leave yourself a lot of time to write fellowship applications, and that may seem obvious, but they take, people say it's like a full-time job, and it is. If you want to have a lot of different people read and comment on your essay, you need to be able to give it to these people well in advance of the deadline for submission. I think cutting and pasting from your dissertation proposal sounds really nice and easy in theory, but what I found is that if I applied for 6 fellowships 2 years ago for this past year, and every essay looked really different at the end by the time I submitted it. The sort of first catchy opening paragraph, I think, was similar for all of them, but the rest of the essays were tailored very differently to the different requirements of each fellowship and the different desires of the organizations. The third piece of practical advice is that I think if you can find titles of successful applications online, that's great, but if you know anybody in your department or a friend who has applied for any of the fellowships that you're applying for and has been successful, ask if you can actually look at their applications at the drafts that they went through. I think for almost all of the fellowships I applied for, I was able to get my hands on through friends and colleagues recent successful applications, and it was really helpful before I started to look those over to get a sense of the different structures that had worked for different organizations. And I think finally, and this has been said, if you really need or want outside funding, apply for as many fellowships as you think you might have even a little chance of getting. This is not an economy in which to say, well, I'm not sure I'm perfect for that fellowship, so I'm not going to apply for it. I think, I would never apply for a grant from the NSF. That would be ridiculous, but I think I know that institutions like the American Academy in Rome fund research that isn't necessarily Italy specific, even though, reading their website, you might think that's only the case, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that a lot of these funding organizations have sort of broader umbrellas than you might think at first, and it's worth giving them a shot. So I will say more later, but that's what I have to say for now.
Thank you very much.
I'll try to add something to all these very useful comments, although I have a few that I think have maybe not been touched on too heavily. I'm an African history student, and I was among those who were sort of shooting for these large area studies oriented kind of grants that you will get to do fieldwork abroad also. And I did fieldwork in Kenya. I had a Fulbright Hayes, rest in peace. And basically what I think would be helpful, the best advice I could probably give is that hasn't already been given repeatedly, is to stress the importance of the methodology part of the grant. If you've had the chance to go somewhere and do preparatory fieldwork, spend a month at an archive or something, if you're a historian, for instance, if you have special skills in a certain area, if you're doing something about ethnobotany and you happen to have a master's degree in, like biology or something like that, those are, worth playing up in your methodology section. The goal being just to convince the readers that you, as an individual, are particularly qualified, more so than anyone else, any of the other applications that they're getting to do this project. The goal is very much to sort of pitch your own sort of set of skills and experiences. That could be language study, that could be the fact that you have made contacts at a research institute in the place that you're going, and you can, tell them about the affiliations that you're going to have and the contributions you're going to make to, your hosts in a certain country. That's very good advice for these grants that are area studies based or involve fieldwork. And also in the methodology, in the question of methodology, making it sound convincing. There's specific questions that you can be answering, like how you can mention what exact files you're going to look at if you're a historian. I'm sorry, I'm a historian. I know not everybody here is, but I'm just thinking along, these lines. You can mention specifically what you're going to do and where you're going to do it and when. And one of the things that I've heard over and over is as very important and convincing in this sort of credential building way is if you are, for instance, I was going to Kenya, and a certain part of Kenya, there's there are seasons to it. There are times you can work better than others. You can say, oh, my plan for, when you're talking about your research plan, my plan for going to this area is I will do this certain amount of work and this type of work during, the rainy times, the rainy season, and I'll do this type of work during Ramadan when, these certain people, won't be available to talk to me. I will go to this archive, first when I show up in Kenya to orient myself. And so if you can make this sort of convincing sounding list of, work list in a way, I think that helps a lot in portraying yourself as somebody who is a good investment for a large grant. So yeah, sequencing is, I think, important. What else can I tell you that already hasn't maybe been said? I can offer you a sort of palliative gesture in saying that you can be a very disorganized person and get one of these grants. All of these things, or not all of these things, but most of these things, these suggestions that are great suggestions, probably didn't happen in my case, and somehow it worked. So, let it not be too much of a deterrent. But from writing another round of grants, actually, what I learned, I think, is that, and what I would have done differently if I could go back and do it again, is that the actual writing process, as many of my co-panelists have said, is very productive. And even if you're keeping a sort of research journal or something like that, that would be a way, I think, to even make this go a lot quicker and a lot easier if you had a sort of running dialogue with yourself in writing, a running sort of moment to sit down and write out what you're thinking about as far as your project goes. That's essentially what I find myself doing every day as I am trying to write, grant applications, and that's what I was doing back in 2009 when I was writing a previous round of grant applications. And I realized that if I was doing that the whole time, I would be saving a lot of effort. What else? Another thing that I thought of in terms of feeling better about your grant applications is to acknowledge the sort of randomness of who is on these committees, as some others have emphasized. The SSRC, which I applied for, gives you comments back from 3 anonymous reviewers. I didn't get that one, and my comments were completely contradictory. Love it, hate it. There's not always a logic to it, and so to some extent, this is very random. What else? Another very concrete thing I wish, this is for humanities, a concrete thing that I wish I would have known when I was starting to apply for grants, for large grants, is simply that there are a couple, and I'm thinking of the JAVITs in particular, that you can apply for when you're a first year student. I don't know how many of you are, but that one was one that wasn't even on my radar, and so that sort of points to the importance of getting on websites like these fellowship websites and looking them up. And as I'm looking for writing grants now, I realize that they're even more spread out, and even possibly more of them out there, but they are very. It takes a lot of searching to actually find writing grants. So I guess we've been talking a lot about, in a way, these big research grants, and then there's this other sort of related genre of write-up grants that you can anticipate, I guess, having to do at some point. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty much all I can say. It hasn't really been gone over, but yeah.
Thank you very much. We do have a good time for discussion. I'm going to abuse the privileges of being chair. Just to add a word of emphasis about the clarity of your prose. And that's what you're going for above all, is clarity. And this the importance also of the opening paragraph or paragraphs. You do not want someone to throw this away in that first minute, and that's the place you have to be very, very clear. I've had an intense couple of weeks, lots of grad students in my office going over their various applications in the last couple of weeks. And with one student, we had a good laugh. I said, I feel like Yossarian. I'm taking out every third word. Often the argument is there, the thesis is there, but as a reader, it's difficult to find. And so you have to take that work entirely away from your reader. Your thesis, your bold claims are only valuable if the reader can actually discern them with a quick read. So you're going for clarity and less cluttered prose very often. I've never aspired to the lyricism of the paragraph that Professor Margie read. I just go for clarity, and I think that often that is a point that escapes us. We're used to writing with a certain amount of ornamentation. And I had an interesting moment just this afternoon with a graduate student in my office who said, I said, this is much better, just much, much better, I said. And she said, that's because I came to the realization that this is a different genre. This is a genre all its own. And that all of what I know about writing for these other genres is only partly applicable. And I just had to create something entirely new for this. And that is sort of part of the message, is that as a writing task, it's a very particular kind of writing task. And you do need help from others in order to do it, because you haven't maybe done it so much before, even though you've written a great deal. And been successful as a writer of other genres. So, you know, that's one way to think about it, and I think in this student's case that was very clarifying. You know, you're writing something that's different from things you've written before. But do go for clarity, do try to pack as much as you can into the opening of the kinds of things that you want to include. You want someone on finishing the first page to know what the stakes are of this project, what the upshot is, what the larger conversations it's part of. You want that to be known. You also want the reader to see your bold claims and really what you're moving towards. So that's enough of me. I just wanted to emphasize the prose writing piece of this that I think is so important, and why you should not feel at all embarrassed about getting help with it, lots of it. I echo the point that often the people who can help the most are people in adjacent fields, because they're not as encumbered with the familiarity with what you're writing against, and they will be your best judges to see whether you're being clear about the stakes of your project and what you want it to do. With that, we can certainly open the floor for questions, comments, and anybody who wants to add anything from the panel, you should feel free to do so. Yes?
You had said there was a specific institution that grants fellowships for anthropology.
Yes.
Could you repeat the name? It's called
The Wenner-Gren Foundation, WENNER-GREN. The only one specifically for anthropology.
Thank you.
It is here, and it will be on the website list.
Yeah, so I was wondering, if you're going to apply for a Fulbright, not for a, in terms of like a research application, but in terms of like an initial teaching assistantship application, in my mind the methodology would be different. You talk about your approach to teaching and things like that. But I was also told that having some sort of like additional research or additional something that, you know, makes even that specific education worthwhile. I guess sort of like, can you talk about that?
Talvacchia is in charge of the Fulbright program. Her husband is a
Let me just briefly answer that question. I am the Fulbright program advisor for graduate students, and my colleague Kim Germain is the program advisor for undergraduates. The English teaching assistantships are a very specific kind of Fulbright, and there are tons and tons of Fulbrights. If you've ever looked at their website, there's lots and lots of different kinds of Fulbrights. Most of you here, I imagine, are looking at the research-based ones, but the English teaching assistantships are a very particular kind of thing where you teach English for a year in countries that have these. And what they're looking for in those situations are two things. They're looking for very good students who are comfortable and willing to get in and teach in a different cultural context. So you don't necessarily have to have a lot of teaching experience, although they like to see some. They're also looking on the side, because you basically are teaching about 20 hours a week. They want you to also have a project that you would spend 20 hours doing. And that project's a little tricky because it can't be a project that is specific to a particular archive in a particular area, because you are placed wherever they place you. You don't decide where you're going to go. So you have to have a project that's related to something you're interested in that will take you to the next step of your professional work. But it's something that's a little bit flexible that can be done in a different kind of location. So it's a very specific kind of Fulbright, and it has a very different kind of focus. It's not so research focused. It's more focused on teaching, on intercultural exchange, and on the research that you would be doing for your next step.
So most of your comments today seem to be for graduate students who are applying for fellowships for writing or research while doing their Ph.D. I was wondering to what extent do your comments hold true for postdoc applications and the fellowship letter that you write for a postdoc? I'm specifically wondering what the ratio of dissertation to new project that you have to put into those letters, which seems so science fiction-y when you're not done your dissertation yet, but yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
One comment about that, which is that having been a reviewer for postdocs, I can say that a lot of one of the mistakes people sometimes make in applying for postdoc is they recycle their predoctoral fellowships. They write as if they haven't written a dissertation. And you really have to kind of change your prose, but also change your mindset when you're writing these, and write as an accomplished a person who will have received the degree. Your dissertation will be in the past, and you will be revising it into book form, or in some cases going on to the next project, or being part of a larger research group. But you really have to change and adopt that mode, because it's very disconcerting when you're doing postdoctoral reviews to find something that looks like a predoctoral proposal in the mix. They aren't generally as successful.
I would add to that just the one caveat, as someone who had a couple of postdocs before I ended up at NYU, that by the same token that oftentimes the postdoctoral applications, at least reading them now on the other side, can seem a little bit over-ambitious to the extent that the idea of miraculously turning it into a book within 9 months' time is sometimes a bit of a stretch, and perhaps focusing on a couple of articles or incorporating the new project into the old one in a way that's also feasible rather than kind of over the moon is also equally important.
When you asked that question, I thought of two students in my department who got postdocs, are in them now. And one did her dissertation in Colombia, South America, on landmine injury and rehabilitation vis-a-vis hospitals and vis-a-vis the military. That was her dissertation. She got a postdoc studying the use of the military, the U.S. military, of virtual reality technology to study, to study and also to perhaps prevent PTSD. So they're putting soldiers to be or soldiers in these technological settings in which they live in advance shock in hopes that they won't get PTSD. So this was related, clearly related, but really quite a departure. And it's taken her to a different place and a completely different set of concerns. And I don't know actually how in the world she did this, because there's the dissertation and the defense, and then suddenly the next thing is you're applying for something completely different. But then another student did what Lori was suggesting, which is you have to go beyond the dissertation. You have to imagine what you would have to do to make a product, a book. To me, foundations really want something out of it. They want a thing. They want to be able to put in the annual report that so and so many articles, books, and things got published. That's really the goal. So you have to really imagine what it would take to make a book out of a dissertation, and that isn't easy. Not at all. And you have to, think of all the things that would actually be involved. What's that?
It's a fiction genre.
It's a fiction genre. And if you really think about that seriously, you can make a very persuasive case for needing a year. Totally persuasive, because everyone knows that it takes at least that. I mean, it takes actually more than that. But,
As I'm writing this it's very difficult to come up with language that says what you're going to do to your dissertation to make it into a book beyond the one line that says, I'm going to work on making this a book. So are there some suggestions of language or other types of, processes that are general, not specific to each project, but general things that get to be done? Is it sort of more research on particular things that you didn't anticipate, or?
Well, again, it depends on the nature of the postdoc that you're writing for. It depends on the audience. If it's for a postdoc to do more research, then you have to make a good case why you have to go back to the research in order to, deepen your set of cases that you dealt with in Chapter 4, why you have to go backward and extend the chronology of what you're doing. There could be all kinds of cases one could make. So it depends on whom you're writing for. If it's one that actually is clearly looking to support additional research, then you have an additional research story. If it's a postdoc where you're writing and while you're teaching, then you can be, again, you want to be schematic without being too detailed, but give enough detail so that it sounds plausible about particular kinds of changes that you want to make, a section you want to add, a set of scholarly literature that you feel is important to bring into the framing of the project. They're additional work and additional writing, but they aren't just revision. So I think we were joking saying that it's fiction writing, but a certain amount of it is aspirational. They understand that it's aspirational, but it still shows that you've really reflected on what you would need to do to make this, to bring it to a wider audience, to connect it to other literatures, that kind of thing. Anybody else want to come in on that?
I'll add one thing. Yes.
Yes. One of the things that Wintergrad Project, Anthropology Project Director told me is that, I think relates to this, is that grant reviewers love one thing above all else. It's, of course, a crude generalization, but that is when the candidate, the applicant, puts their own assumptions at risk. And that's a little counterintuitive, because you think of yourself as putting other people's assumptions at risk, and you're going to gallop into the field and slay the dragons of all the wrong things that have been done. But what really captures the reader is that you have the courage to take a risk with your own assumptions. That's an intellectual, that's really appealing intellectually. So I was thinking, if you have a dissertation, it's a done deal. But what have you rethought? What have you realized, partly because of your defense or just time passing, really need to come back to? I think that would be very captivating. Not too much, just a little.
Anybody Anybody else? Don't be shy.
Yeah, I could say that we have one. I'm sort of wondering
I guess I'm sort of wondering what sort of space there is to propose projects that are somewhat unfamiliar within the sort of, I mean, so I'm wondering sort of, are each of these, grants that you're applying for very specific, or could you sort of tweak the project? So for example, I've been thinking about sort of a potential project of putting together a lecture series that would culminate in sort of biannual journal sort of format, and I'm thinking where, like, what would there be a specific venue that I would sort of seek out to look for a grant for that specific project, or could I, do you think, apply to more general grants for research in humanities, say, or for some sort of interdisciplinary sort of research, and then sort of propose this project that might not look like something that is more standard or more familiar?
Well, I only know what my field does with that kind of thing, that there's certain foundations that will support exactly that kind of project. And the Werner Grant Foundation, as a matter of fact, has a conference, a budget for conferences, and that end up in publications. And it has its own application stream, separate from the research projects. So I don't know other possibilities, but you would have to go to these various databases that have been mentioned, because they won't, my sense is that this would not fall under the regular research grant. It would be a separate venture that they would be willing to fund, or not. I don't know what other people know.
I guess I was sort of following up your I lost it again. Your sort of comment about sort of applying to things that you might,
I think
not
the
exactly
fellowships that I
specific.
applied for were specifically to support research, and the ones that I applied for, I don't think would fund the conference organization. But have you looked for funding more locally?
Yeah, I'm sure that there are very specific.
I mean, within our institution, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it goes to the sort of know your enemy, I'm sorry, I didn't say that, know your audience point, that, you look at whatever you can find about these granting institutions, so you know what kinds of things, and if there's any hint there that this is something they'd be open to, then you spin it. I was recalling some years ago, someone did a massive study on trying to boil down what the characteristics were of people who were successful getting grants. And they could only find one. People who were successful getting grants apply for a lot of grants. That's it. And so, sometimes if you can stretch something and put in an application, you do, right? Because you never know, you could get it.
I have no idea what your topic is, but I know that the American Academy in Rome and certain other research institutions abroad kind of fancy themselves not just research institutions, but kind of artist colonies also. So they do have different kinds of grants, but again, it has to be related to overseas funding or other.
Do we have a last question? Well, I think we've reached a very important part of this function, which is the networking phase. Am I wrong that these things that were out there were actually a reward for having come? I would like to thank the panelists. Please help me thank them. Thank you all for coming, and don't hesitate to follow up with us if we weren't being clear. Thank you.